So it's a panel of really impressive people. Eric is senior editor of technology at the Journal of Commerce. Next to him is Ahmad, who's chief revenue officer at Transfix. We're excited to have him join us because Transfix is the biggest logistics technology company in New York, with the New York Supply Chain Meetup, also known as the Worldwide Supply Chain Federation. So we felt it makes sense to have them join us. Bob is at Maersk. Maersk is the world's largest container shipping company, or the world's largest shipping company, period. Bob was in Asia. Bob was in Asia building an e-commerce business for Maersk and came home about, 2 months ago to build that same business here. Next to him is Juliana, who is an AI and operations expert at Princeton University. She's also the head of AI at Optimal Dynamics. Optimal Dynamics is going to be part of the showcase tomorrow. And at the very end, farthest from me, is Joel, who is joining us all the way from the University of San Diego, where he runs their Supply Chain Management Institute. And his experience covers the entire gamut as far as supply chain and logistics goes. So on that note, I'm going to hand things over to the very capable Eric, who I describe as probably the best logistics tech journalist in the world.
You might want to hold your applause till after I moderated this panel. I don't know why Brian keeps inviting me, but I'm going to keep accepting the invitation until he stops. So, seriously though, thank you, and this is a fantastic achievement to pull together over the last 2 years, but especially an event of this magnitude is really great. And looking forward to discussing a lot of crucial issues, things that I write about and talk to people about all the time. And we, as Brian mentioned, we have a really capable and expert panel. I know Brian gave you a little bit of background on them, but I also wanted them to really briefly touch on some context around what they're doing right now and what they've done in their past that will kind of underscore the the importance of why they're on the panel. And then I'm going to launch into a series of rapid fire questions. We don't have any presentations, so we're just going to be chatting. I would encourage you all to get to ask questions as well. As we saw in the previous panels, the more interactive this is, the better. So, real briefly, Ahmad, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you came to Transfix, and then we'll go down the line.
Sure. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Yeah. So I have been at Transfix for ages, actually 4 months. I'm a New Yorker as of Sunday, so my stuff has moved out of San Francisco. Don't have a home yet. I spent the last 19 plus years at Intel, doing a variety of roles.
What does Intel do? I've never heard of that.
Intel works very closely with our host here. But we're a small chip company out of the Bay Area, Silicon Valley. You know, the silicon of Silicon Valley, that's us. We do about a little bit under $70 billion. Dollars, or they do. Now I'm at Transfix.
That Transfix revenue is really growing. You're doing your job well.
The last few years at Intel, I looked after our storage and memory business. I was out in Hong Kong building that business for Intel in that region, and then came back the last couple of years looking after a new product line for Intel, as well as our non-volatile memory. Across all verticals globally, so banking, telecom, financial services, cloud, manufacturing, all the way through. I had to really explain myself to a lot of mentors why I want to go into trucking and logistics. But I have a lot of personal passion for that, and as I looked at the market opportunity and what the team at Transfix have built, talking to a lot of people in our space, it was truly love at first sight, and I'm excited to share a little bit more about what we're doing at Transfix and what our vision is for the industry.
Yeah, cool. We'll get to that. Bob, you also are recently back from Hong Kong as well, right?
That's right.
Right. So Bob O'Donnell. I started at Maersk up in New Jersey. I've got a quite eclectic background, you could say. I started in supply chain management operations here in New Jersey. I then moved to China, to Chengdu. If you don't know what that is, it's a little small city of like 12 million. You know,
A lot of pandas.
a lot of pandas. That's where all the pandas come from. I was doing origin supply chain management operations there. Then I moved to Hong Kong, and I was doing key account management for Asia for a lot of our bigger retail and lifestyle customers. And then about 2.5, 3 years ago, we started up e-commerce logistics. E-commerce probably is not the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Maersk. I don't know how many people know what Maersk is. We're the big ocean shipping company. But what we've decided to do is we've started to extend out our supply chains, you could say. So what we're doing is goods that are bought online. We're picking up from the factories that produce that, wherever that is in the world. We're bringing that over into an inventory, and then we're also doing final mile to individual people into their homes. Obviously, we're not running Maersk trucks. We're still using the major, let's say, final mile providers. But we are tying that whole end-to-end supply chain together. So I've done that for 2 years in Hong Kong, setting up some emerging markets in China, India, Southeast Asia. And now we've put a lot more investment into this, so now we've got some regional heads, and we're kind of becoming a global omni-channel fulfillment company. So that's what I'm doing here in North America.
Juliana?
Oh, hi, I'm Juliana. So as Brian introduced me, I wear 2 hats. I'm an academic. I do research on artificial intelligence optimization at Princeton University. Better? Better? Okay.
That's better.
You don't have to yell.
You guys are waiting.
So as I was saying, I wear 2 hats. I'm an academic at Princeton University doing research on artificial intelligence and optimization. And I also work for a startup. I'm the head of AI for a startup doing AI for logistic problems. But previously in my life, I'm originally from Brazil. So I have been on the whole of the spectrum. I have been a buyer. I was the head of operations planning for Kimberly-Clark, Brazil, for 8 years. So doing supply chain in Latin America. It's not for the faint of heart. And now I've come full circle. I'm really, so I have been on the buyer side. Now I'm on the builder side and also an academic. So I think I have the privilege of have been everywhere, and doing this bridge really excites me. And I'm a mathematician by training. So I started out proving theorems, and here I am.
Wow.
We'll be getting to the mathematics stuff later, so you'll all be
Okay.
quizzed. You'll all be quizzed on that afterwards.
I can hardly wait for the mathematics. Can everybody hear me? Is that here? So I'm Joel Sutherland, and the interesting thing is that I've kind of come full circle because I started 45 years ago. I got my degree in logistics from the University of Southern California, and I'm back at the university now at the University of San Diego. But in between that, I was at vice president level at the Toyota organization. I was at ConAgra slaughtering cattle. Students like me to say disassemble. I was at International Paper where we started a new business. I went to, well, what was called Sealand before Maersk stole them. Okay, so we were developing this worldwide 3PL, so we were owned then by CSX Rail. So we had rail, intermodal, we were buying trucking companies, warehousing companies. I lived for a while in Amsterdam and then moved into Germany, set up an office over there, traveled a lot to Asia because of my Japanese contacts. And then I went to, once Maersk got us out of business, then I went to some other companies, pharmaceutical included, went to a company called J.B. Hunt Transport. But we were creating a new company that was technology-based called Transplace. So we created Transplace, and we grew that company where it's today the largest U.S. transportation management company that's around. From there, I went to manage my own company. So I was president doing cross-border NAFTA type transactions for the automotive industry, but president of my own company. And then I went to Lehigh University for 5 years, and I've been at USD for 8 years now. But the intent is because of taking that industry experience and bridging the gap and bringing that back where the students get kind of that experiential education. They get the real world knowledge. And I also work with faculty so they can do real world projects. So we bring projects, consulting projects, and so forth. So that's the quick flyby.
That has to be the most varied background I've ever heard of anybody. I think you were a shipper, a trucker, a container carrier, self-employed, academia.
That's
Did I
all
miss
part of it. I
anything?
only gave you half.
Astronomer.
But what I tell students is that you can be anywhere in the world. You can work for any kind of company, any industry, any size company, because everybody has a supply chain. So it's
There's some slogan that you guys came up with for that, right? Right, Brian? So anyway, we have lots to cover. Thank you guys for your background. I think that helps kind of frame the discussion. I want to keep this kind of fast moving because I have lots of ground to cover, and I want to get to as much of it as possible. Let me start off. I want to go down the line. If you could, in a dream world, tackle one supply chain issue that you see shippers facing. And when I say shippers, I mean the owners of the cargo, for people who are not familiar with the lingo or jargon in our industry. But one thing that you see them struggling with that is a really problematic thing that technology can help with if you had a blank checkbook and all the time in the world.
Yeah, no blank checkbook with our VCs, but I actually, what we're trying to do at Transfix is really solve this very inefficient marketplace, both for shippers and carriers. So we're unleashing, whether it's mobile tether technology in the hand of drivers, to all the way back to the machine learning, where we ingest everybody's network and everybody's capacity on both sides of the marketplace, and really try to optimize and utilize these assets. But if there's one problem that's near and dear to my heart is technology will only take us so far, and we've got the best technology out there. It's really the business model. And I draw parallels from my time in storage and memory. It's a very cyclical market as well, but a very complex way to go solve when the market is really tight, because you have to go build factories and dig holes in the ground and spend billions of dollars on it. So it's harder, or it takes longer to correct or adjust. So we saw an opportunity there to really think through predictability. And if I go kind of reflect back on the past few months, talking to shippers, their number one concern is predictability. But there's that lack of trust creates this unbalanced, constant supply and demand. And how do we go solve that together? I think it's the one problem I want to go tackle. So we talk a little bit more about that.
Bob?
Just from talking to our customers, I would say predictive analytics. The number one thing that I think that was being talked about earlier was all this waste in the supply chains. And I think that a lot of that would be removed if we had strong predictive analytics. I think a lot of our customers are sitting on a whole bunch of data, and they're just not using that data properly. So where you can start to predict things in advance of things happening, I think that would help a lot. So that's something Maersk is working a lot with our customers on, kind of co-creating technology together with them.
Juliana?
From a shipper's perspective, I think the last mile is a huge problem, because previously the customers would do the last mile. Now it's up to the shippers to do the last mile, and a lot of the times we are not shipping around high added value items. So we need to find a way to make it cheaper, to make the baskets worthwhile. So find a way to the customers buy more added value things with low value things, because right now what was on the customer end is on the shipper, and it's very expensive. So how can we create value out of that?
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
How many licensed carriers, trucking companies, are there in this country? How many people think that there's more than 100,000? Okay? How many people think there's over 250,000? How about over 500,000? How about over 1 million? Okay, you're right. There's, in terms of the number, what?
Over a million. Over a million.
She was right, and there was one other back here that were right. Of course, there are 1.5, roughly, I'll just round it out, licensed carriers in this country. About half of those are for-hire carriers, about 700,000. The other half would be private carriers or a mix of other carriers that didn't have a particular identification. So the problem that I think we have is that we've got a fragmented industry. And this is part of what your company is trying to solve, is that how do you find that carrier with the best rate, with the best safety record in your neighborhood, wanting to go to the next location? We've got about 20% of the vehicles on the road are empty at any time. So we've got a tremendous amount of waste. So it's a matter of harnessing all of those carriers. 90% of those carriers that I mentioned are 6 trucks or less. So you hear about Jaden Hunt. You must have gone to school. She's going, oh,
She works at
I feel like
Transfix.
I've been being tested.
She's
here.
my
So
mom.
in any case, that's what I think is the huge problem for us to solve, is harnessing all that capability in that empty, wasted space.
So we had an interesting prep call. You guys should have been there. It was really awesome. You missed it. You missed a great conversation. And a couple things that came out of that conversation that Juliana especially mentioned were this idea that supply chain optimization, or supply chain, sorry, is a big optimization problem. And I know like what you're doing, both I would imagine on the commercial side, but also on the academic side, relates to figuring out this really complex problem with so many variables that humans can't even account for all of them. So how should people in the audience think about tackling that optimization problem as a big puzzle? Like how do you think about it in your academic work, and how can that transfer over into their commercial lives?
Well, first, as a practitioner, there's a lot of room for automation. We are not even at optimization yet, because we can leave to the computer to do the tedious work that right now are being done in spreadsheets. Doing this first step is going to be a huge deal. And after we do that, then we can think as a giant optimization problem, because then the output of one step is going to be the input to the next step. And maybe when we are doing this step, you can already evaluate the impact this is going to have on your next step in the supply chain. But first, we still have this huge challenge of automation.
Yeah, certainly automation, and Bob, you brought up the voluminous amounts of data. The result of all these big data initiatives now is that we have all this stuff to sort through. Can you give an example of some of those inputs leading? So say we have a hold on automation, and we have a handle on what data we need, when we need it, where we need it. What does that puzzle look like where things are just automatically triggering the next step? Can you give an like a tangible example?
For example, you have production scheduling. Then you have to do PO consolidation. Then you have to do what is the mode of transportation. Then you need to do from a port to yards. Then you have, let's say, the last mile. So all are very big problems that are very interconnected. So when we can automate, the output of my production schedule is my input for my PO consolidation. And all of these, in the end, you need to have service level. You want to deliver it on time, and you want to maximize profit. And all this technology is going to bring a lot of transparency. So you have to be as efficient as possible, because your customer is going to know, and he's going to have alternatives. So you have to be very efficient and transparent. So I think that technology is going to help with that.
Bob and Ahmed, as service providers, how do you think about that puzzle, and where are we on that sort of continuum?
Sure. I think Juliana hits on a couple of very core parts of our thesis in our business, which is automation, transparency, and then doing it efficiently. What we bring to the table is automating every part of that process that a traditional player can't do, and do it in a way that scales. So our business scales, we actually get even more efficient from a margin structure, more efficient from a resource structure. And whether it's a very large shipper or a very small self-serve shipper, we continue to think through how are we automating all this movement of goods that we're doing for them or executing for them. But the other part that she mentioned that we are very laser focused on is the transparency and the value creation at different parts of the process, on both sides of the marketplace. We treat our carriers as customers. We think about their profitability. How do we utilize their assets? How do we become more than 80, 90% of their business? We believe that kind of loyalty drives actually better KPI results and more adoption of our technology. So we're able to track, trace, and really ingest all the data that we need to manage by exception. And on the shipper side, we think through, we're actually building tools. So it's not just an app in a driver's hand, but it's what are the tools that a dispatcher needs? What are the tools that a carrier owner needs to manage their business? So we're thinking through all of that and how we're automating that and how we're continuing to drive that loyalty. On the shipper side, we're thinking through how do we harness all the data now that we have this data because we're moving their freight. How do we go back and say, there's actually bottlenecks in your own supply chain, whether it's facilities, whether it's end-to-end scheduling, whether it's the way they route their freight. And then what tools do they need? What tools do we change and save working hours for the different parts of their organization, their coordinators, their decision makers, their planners. So we're thinking through that. And I think both from a transparency perspective and an automation perspective is something that we're doing. And we're bringing our technology into the marketplace.
Optimization is a really tricky word because oftentimes, in any business, you're dealing with people. And what I've seen in a lot of our customers is you have different groups that are all optimizing in a silo.
That's right.
So specifically in e-commerce, what I see is that there's whole logistics teams at the brands that are in charge of getting it from the factory to an inventory, wherever that is. And then you have a different team that says, where's my inventory? I need to get it to consumers who bought my product online. So my favorite example, we're dealing with a major US department store. They primarily manufacture in China, so they bring everything across from China into the US, into the West Coast. And they've completely optimized that all the way through. But then they have the e-commerce team that wants to start selling online in China to Chinese consumers. So the e-commerce team says, okay, where's my inventory? Oh, it's in LA. I'm going to bring it back to China.
That's just filling the backhaul for Maersk, though. So
It's a great proposition.
I'm giving you a hard time.
So you're not wrong, but we're one of the few companies where we're able to think beyond that and try to think what's best for our
Your
customers.
job is to get away from that thing.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. So this company is not the exception. There's a lot of companies that have their entire systems in place, their processes, their organizational structure is not. They're all optimized for their silo rather than seeing the whole thing. So to Juliana's point, when you start getting automation and technology involved, you can kind of get around those egos, you could say, within an organization.
That's really well put, I think, people talk about silos of decision making all the time, but data can be kind of the thing that cuts through those organizational inefficient structures, right? So from an academic perspective, Joel, bringing your past experience, how do you sort of explain these challenges of optimization to students, right?
Let me go back to my industry experience.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Start there.
I always share this with students because they're stories that I can relate, but I think to optimize, you need to have something to optimize. And that takes scale. So critical mass is important. So when we created Transplace, the biggest problem that we had is we didn't have critical mass of customers' freight that we could manage. And so we got 6 companies to kind of combine their critical mass, the amount of freight that they manage. So we grew we were about $350 million in managed freight when we started at J.B. Hunt Logistics. When we created Transplace and we did this merger of 6 companies, we grew to over $1 billion in one fell swoop. that gave us the critical mass, enough freight that we could match lanes and we could optimize and we could route and we could develop the necessary business rules, because in optimization, business rules can kill you. If you don't know when a warehouse is open or a shipper's location is open or closed, or what kind of equipment they have, what kind of docks they have, it can be a deal killer. So it's very complex, but you need critical mass and you need good data, which doesn't exist.
We have it.
You know, one thing, just to kind of put a bow on this part of the discussion, one thing, we talked so much about these interesting retail technologies that were presented this morning. I keep having conversations from a freight perspective about the importance of demand sensing, especially in the retail side. I think there's an understanding now that demand sensing is critical to some of the optimization stuff, but also just optimally using the right mode. From a pure cost perspective, like you can't expedite, you can't air freight every single shipment, right? So how does tech kind of help bridge that gap between demand? Because there's a whole nother category of software that is focused on demand sensing. That's not freight's job, but how do you connect to that? Is that something you guys are thinking about?
Yeah, I'm assuming this is or any of this. Okay. Yeah, actually, as a matter of fact, we're working with some of our very large shippers that are in the retail space on dynamic capacity. So part of when we ingest everybody's network, and we typically ask the customers that trust us to give us 4 years of history of what they actually moved. So we think we're the best pulse in the industry, even from a predictive pricing perspective. But we work with them as they launch new brands. We're in this pilot mode now to take it all the way back from a vendor who's launching a new brand all the way to the retail shelf. And we're working with them on a dynamic capacity. So it's inventory in motion. How do you don't know if this is going to be successful or not, or is it seasonal, is it back to school or not? And then if it's successful, how do you make sure there's a flow all the way through your DCs down to your retail shelf? Because the opportunity cost of not selling is massive, right? So we're touching that product in multiple times. But then we're doing that specifically for a very large retailer that's trying to forward plan, but do it in a way that they could flex up or down. The other example is where we pick up raw plastics for one of our customers. Raw material, they make it into pallets. We pick it up again from them. That goes into a toothpaste cap. Then we pick it up again from that CPG customer, and then we take it to the retail shop, or we take it to the retailer. So we've touched that product multiple times, and they're different companies. They have business together. Some of them pay for the pickup, some of them pay for the delivery, and that changes. I'm learning that about this industry. It's kind of very interesting.
The leverage and
who has the leverage?
And range.
Yeah, it's incredible. I have a few things I've learned that are still shocking me. But then getting everybody in a room, which is kind of nirvana, and talking about scheduling. I mean, the end-to-end scheduling, and how do you optimize that? And do it predictably. Right? So we're really kind of trying to deepen beyond just moving a load or moving a full truckload.
I'd like a word about the demand forecasting or demand sensory. From an academic perspective, from the person who does it behind the scenes, the artificial intelligence piece, there is not such a thing as a crystal ball. The artificial intelligence is not going to give you the demand is going to be that. But the technology can help you evaluate your risks and cost your different scenarios and plan for things that might happen. So going into this with the expectation that artificial learning is going to be a crystal ball and predict the future perfectly, this is not going to happen, but it's going to help you making decisions on an uncertain future.
Yeah. Do you want to go a little bit into what we were talking about before, where you would run a certain number of scenarios, and then, and I mean, you're probably better off explaining this, but as I understood you explaining it, you might run 20 scenarios, and if 18 of them are what you want to happen, then you dispatch a truck and
For
to that.
example, when managing a large fleet of truckers, they are driving long distance, and maybe you don't know. You're sending a driver, let's say, from New York to LA, and when you do this assignment, you don't know yet if you're going to have a demand out of LA to bring him back home to Chicago. So what we do is, instead of getting a point forecast of the demand out of LA 3 days from now, what we do is, based on historical demand, we generate multiple scenarios, let's say 20 scenarios. And out of these 20, if we are able to bring him back home on time 18 times, then we say, okay, we can do this assignment. This is what new technology is being able to do. I think this is the major shift now between the current technology and what up-and-coming technologies are doing, and what the cloud and optimization solvers are allowing us to do is to evaluate a decision multiple times and then make sure that they are robust enough. And we still need the role of expert knowledge, of people running the business, of practitioners, because you still need to make a decision. You need to tell, is 18 enough, or do you have a contract with your drivers that for sure they need to be there? Then maybe it's not 18. 18 is not enough. It has to be 20. Or you have a more loose-end contract, and 10 out of 20 is fine. So we still need, so the most capable AI systems right now, they work in conjunction with the practitioners, with the expert knowledge, with the people who knows the business, because you are using AI to help you making the decisions.
Just one quick comment. You've not lived until you've seen a data scientist from Harvard arguing with an ex-JB Hunt person about what was optimal, and then the JB Hunt guy actually turning out to be right, because the truck shows 7 miles away from North Jersey, but it's in New York. So the better truck was actually the one 40 miles away in South Jersey, right? And so you can't. So it's really incredible, the optimization that happens, and then you have to bring then back the human and the expertise, so you could make the right decision.
So you were talking about silos before, but it's not only silos. There is also this dimension of time, that your decision that you make now is going to affect your decisions in the future. And the future is uncertain. It's keep changing. So you need to take that into account, and technology now allows us to do that.
So let me, Joel, I want to get your thoughts, but I'm going to pitch this next question to you.
Okay.
So take my question and also what you were going to say. But we have a relatively new company in the industry and a relatively not new company in the industry. What should the industry? How should the industry think of what startups are doing versus what incumbent technology providers are doing? So, Joel, give your thoughts on what you wanted to before, and then I want you to answer, because it's not fair for these guys to answer first. So.
Wait, you did what? What do you want me to do?
So give us your thought. Give us your thought that you wanted on the
it was
previous
demand.
question. Yep.
It was on the demand side, because the demand starts with the customer, right? That's what demand means. What does the customer want? So I told you all about the disassembly business of cattle, right? So at ConAgra, we were disassembling about 20,000 head of cattle a day in four plants. And we had firm orders for about 50% of that, just over 50%. And so sales would say, you know what, just each plant is $1 billion, just disassemble, 5,000 head of disassemble, 20,000, and we will find the customer. So they loaded the trucks, and then they would say, head them east, and they would call and say, okay, we'll give you 25 cents a pound off per pound. And so as it's going further east, then the discounts would be even greater until they found a customer. Now, that's not the way to run a business. So we asked the question to the customer, why aren't you buying our product? And they said, because you're shipping us the wrong product. It's very seasonal in terms of the products that were purchased by the customers. The Krogers, the Walmarts, all of those. They said it has to be based on the weather patterns, because if it's in New York in March and we have a 70-degree day, we want a barbecue, right? So you're not sending the right cuts of beef. So we developed algorithms, technology to forecast what the weather was going to be like 10 days out. We adjusted the disassembly process to get the right cuts of meat so that we could meet that demand. We increased demand accuracy, or demand to actual fulfillment, by 35%. There were other things, but that was the key one that we found, is weather matters. Customers, ask them, they know.
Yeah, really interesting. So now I'm going to pitch you the question. What, from the outside looking in now, what are startup technology providers in the logistics space doing that incumbents are not, and vice versa? Where do you see their strengths kind of lying? Is that something you think about?
That I think about?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, we're still thinking in these silos. It's still more transaction-based than really having any kind of a collaboration. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I think is so important, I wrote a paper almost 20 years ago on collaborative transportation management. And it was really getting the various parties together to identify what their needs were so that everyone could win. You know, let's stop beating up the carrier. And so even though we know it and we talk about collaboration, we talk about matching lanes, we talk about this, the technology is not throughout the industry. It is very siloed, it's very isolated, and we're really not engaging those various parties, not just the carrier, but the people that are moving inbound product, outbound product, and getting them all into this network.
Go ahead, Bob.
What I've seen with startups is that they're dealing with the latest and newest and coolest technology, but they're coming at it from a point of view thinking that everybody is doing what they're doing. And you have incumbents who are used to, like a lot of our major customers and brands that we deal with, supply chain, for better or worse, is oftentimes viewed as a cost center, so they don't often have the latest technology. So you have incumbents, the incumbent technology providers, who are used to that, so therefore they deal with the new technology, but they make it backwards compatible with the old stuff to make it much more adaptable. Whereas a lot of the startups, they're talking in a different language that a lot of the brands are not able to necessarily follow. So where Maersk is playing is we're dealing with a lot of this newest technology. You mentioned AI, blockchain, RFID, all that fun stuff. But we're making sure that we're making it practical for our customers. So making sure that it's backwards compatible, so we can kind of help our customers get brought into the new age, you could say.
Is that fair? I mean, do you have that conversation with shippers?
Absolutely. I think it's something that we've been very cognizant of, not to be just another technology startup, especially with kind of our founding principle of coming from trucking. One of our founders has been in trucking since he was 12 years old. I think, Joel, you know him well. And then half the company is trucking, and then the rest, the difference of how we approach it, we're really building tools and unleashing technology, but with trucking and core logistics in mind. So we're not building it in a vacuum with some data scientist. We're building it side by side with a JB Hunt or a CH Robinson or an Echo or a TQL. Those are some of the people that we have in our shop. But then backward compatibility is something that I come from. We try to make it as easy as possible, so we can ingest your data, whether it's via email or you could still call us. CSV, or a spreadsheet, or we connect with you in EDI, or we're the best, and rapid collaboration of helping you build your dynamic API. And we've done that with some very big customers. Some of that is very public, and how we actually collaborate with them and co-develop that technology. So we do it. If you look at kind of our core technology, it's able to ingest this data from any source. We can connect to your TMS. We could connect to your EDI under 2 weeks. We could connect all the way back to your ERP. So regardless of your sophistication or version that you have, we're able to do that. We make it seamless. So that's on the connection side. But I think the other thing, I really firmly believe that technology only takes you so far. The inefficiency in this market is there's a tremendous opportunity for business model innovation as well. I was shocked to hear that a publicly traded carrier, like a very, very large asset-based carrier, sitting across the table, not you, sitting across, you're a partner. We'll pick up all these containers. And that's okay. And a very large shipper that's also a publicly traded company that has hundreds of millions of dollars of freight. They have a contract, but then when the market tightens, the carrier doesn't go pick up their awarded volume. It just blew my mind. I'm still in shock.
You really haven't been in this industry.
Oh, I'm all right. Yeah. I was like, it's a contract. And so I asked the shipper, I'm like, so why are you not enforcing? I'm talking about a $500 million FTL spend. And we're one of their top 5 carriers, and we're trying to adhere to this world of 100% acceptance at all times, whether it's good or bad, both in an awarded way and a dynamic spot way. So the shipper explains like, well, but because we really don't want to commit the volume. And I think everybody's hedging their bets. And it's exasperating this problem that you talked about earlier, this very fragmented supply. And when the market is soft, trucking companies go out of business. Guess what comes next? A very tight market. When now people want to go maximize every possible dollar or rate per mile. So I believe there is an opportunity for us to think through long-term relationships, predictable, build on trust, transparent, repeatable business, protecting the carrier side to be profitable when the market is soft, not gouging the shippers when the market is tight, and showing up to pick up their freight, but do it in a multi-year, do it really in a very cohesive way, and then bring all the technology that you can to really unleash the data and solve and optimize the routes and the freight and the lanes and the backhaul and the head haul and your facilities. And when I talk to shippers about that, and they're like, okay, that's possible. And we had to do it in storage and memory from my past history. So I think that is a big missing piece in this industry. And I remain shocked until I try to see a couple of partners to help solve it.
So I think it's a very great panel you guys have in terms of, Eric has been covering all the startups, Transfix, JB Hunt, academic carrier. I'm curious, as young founders tackling the space, I have 2 questions. Where do you see the future of specifically the freight brokers and forwarders that have gotten most of the funding? And what do you think young founders should be tackling? Because, people that are getting a lot of the funding, like the Flexports, Convoys, Transfix, they get a lot of slack about how they're subsidizing margins and all these things, but they also seem to be one of the few that can, do the full stack solution that it seems everyone is kind of trying to do. And then, the SaaS players they have the nice margins, they have a SaaS, but they have to do all this change management and they can't really control all the data. So, as someone who's entered the space a year ago, I'm really curious where people in the industry, what should you be tackling and what's the future?
So it's a really good question. I want to address the margin thing because actually what I hear in the market is not that the digital brokers or freight forwarders are actually undercutting rates. I hear the opposite. I actually hear that most of them are charging slightly above market. So that's a misconception that I think gets put out there, but it's not always true. I think in terms of what role new founders have in a market like this, at some point, let's take Flexport. They got $1 billion. They're now $1 billion company, not in revenue, but they have $1 billion to spend. They are not, contrary to another misconception, they are not going to build every single last thing themselves. So there's going to be opportunity. They're using outside technology today, and they will continue to use outside technology. So there are going to be opportunities as these companies morph into kind of established, and they'll be the hunted in 5 to 10 years to be partners for them on the technology side. So it's there's going to be opportunities for the next wave of entrepreneurs to kind of support these companies as they get bigger. So
yeah, I would. Which startup are you with? I'm just curious.
We're a digital freight forwarder for cross-border Mexico, U.S.
Got it. Okay, we should talk after this. I could validate what you just said. We are gross margin positive on a unit economics basis. Now we're a startup. We're investing. We're not a profitable startup. We definitely have a mandate of growth because we're hiring data scientists like you've never seen. But we're definitely
data cleanup people, right?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. That's a whole other panel, yes. We're definitely hiring the best and the brightest and continue to build our technology. But we are gross margin positive because we've automated. Back to the automation. We could have a shipper that comes on, gets an instant price, books it, and the load is executed with no touch. We work with very large shippers, some of our largest customers that have awarded us tens of millions of dollars of freight. When we're in these awarded lanes and we're in this volume, we're able to automate most of that. So now our teams are managing by exception, right? And they're using data to go unlock. So because we're able to do that, our cost of operation and our margin structure, we could operate in a very different structure than what traditional players that are out there. So we view ourselves as somewhere in the middle. We're not a startup, just tech or be publicly traded. We're really thinking through how do we prove and scale a business model. So in 10 years from now, we aspire to be around and growing, and we think the market will shape who are the top players. But I think it's so fragmented. There's so much opportunity out there. So maybe we're in a leadership position from a market share perspective versus the people that are here today, but I think they'll still be around as well.
I have a ton of questions, but yeah, I want to make sure we get some audience.
Just on that note, digitalization and digital brokerage. What do you think about in terms of companies? And I've heard that because a lot of the digital players don't have the asset base, they're highly dependent on third parties, and obviously in terms of peaks, they can't fulfill some of those orders, and so you see Amazon, getting into that asset base supply chain. Any comments on that? Of course, Maersk, you're more of a traditional incumbent, and of course you are both asset based as well as digital platform. Any comments on some of that trend moving forward?
For sure. I don't want to talk about any of the other competition or that A word that you mentioned. But I can say, I didn't think I was that funny, jeez.
That's nervous laughter. That's
was
nervous
it?
laughter.
No, absolutely. A lot of our customers come to us because we have the assets that we can control ourselves. And there's a lot of value to that they see. But bringing in the digitalization and the different technology that we're bringing in, our customers see a lot of value in that for sure.
We actually view ourselves not as a digital broker or only as a digital broker, as truly a virtual network. So we look up to do companies need to have their own dedicated assets, or should we virtualize that? And we're actually piloting with a couple of very large customers that have dedicated assets where their executive told us, hey, can you help me virtualize? So then you're doing the dead haul and the back haul for me. And part of our network. We're going through that today. But we view ourselves as an aggregation of these carriers, small businesses, mid-sized businesses, assets that are 5 to 25, 25 to 100, that have a very interesting power unit to trailer ratio that are just not utilized. They don't have the scale to go bid on a national RFP. So when we aggregate them well, we were able to do that for them, right, or on their behalf. But our focus is on their book of business, their utilization. So how do I layer the RFP I've won from a bottler over an RFP that I've won from a CPG customer, their national networks, and then become 90+% of this carrier's business. It's predictable, it's long term. And it drives the right performance and loyalty, right? So that's kind of what we're trying to. It's not just matching the nearest truck to the load that we just heard about yesterday. We do that, but it's really about aggregating this very long tail of a fragmented supply in a way that's predictable, reliable, transparent, and drives a profitable business for them. And we could talk a little more about that.
Just to comment on that, and that is that, we call it the Amazon effect.
Yep.
And it's not just transportation. I mean, yes, they just bought, a bunch of new planes yesterday or today. It was in the press. And they have trucks, and they have all the delivery vehicles. They also have over 100 million square feet of warehousing.
That's right.
So the question I ask students every year is to take a look at Amazon, and are they displacing traditional 3PLs? Because they have something called critical mass of stuff, right? So because they have all this stuff, now they can transform their business into a logistics business. With all the transport capabilities, ultimately they're going to bring everything they can, all the freight forwarding, all the customs brokerage, all of that is going to be brought in-house. So they're going to displace a lot of businesses. Good thing for some startup businesses, they may be acquired.
Or
the good thing about startups is that they lay the path for those companies that want to possess that capability.
and it also makes us indispensable for people that are trying to compete with Amazon.
I'm just crossing fingers they don't buy ships.
I think they're a lot smarter than that, Bob. Okay, yeah.
Slightly adjacent to this topic, but you guys represent such a great what sorts of workforce and talent issues do you see right now? Do you anticipate? Just are you experiencing in your respective domains?
We were actually just talking about this right before we came on. I personally think, and I obviously want the people who are actually in the business of training the next generation. I think what's really interesting is 5 to 10 years from now, you're going to have a whole class of people who've graduated from supply chain management programs. I think Joel is the outlier in the industry right now. Most people fall into this business. They don't aspire to be in it while they're in college. That's changing because you have a supply chain management program at every other college has one now. So I think, I'm not saying there's still going to be a race for talent, and tech talent especially is going to be pulled in every single industry's direction. But you're at least going to have a group of people coming out of Joel's program and from the work that Juliana is doing attached to that is trained like current generations never were.
So in Maersk, at least, we have a lot of our employees that have been there for a very long time. They come into the business. They've been there for a while. I personally have been reading a lot of Harari, which he wrote *Sapiens* and he wrote *Homo Deus*, and it's talking about the future of the workforce. And I can say within the next 5 to 10 years, people are not going to be having lifelong careers doing the same thing. So I think the most important thing for employees going forward and people who are entering into the job market is to be very emotionally resilient and be able to reinvent yourself. So do something for 5 years, but then when AI overtakes that, being able to reinvent yourself into something else.
Yeah, there's definitely, I think part of your question was labor, but there's a difference between labor and talent. So we produce talent at the university. The labor issues, they still exist in transportation. I mean, we are reinventing that. We're paying more for drivers, more team drivers, more ethnic drivers we need the influx of people coming into this country that want to drive trucks, because most people don't. We take a look at autonomous vehicles. That scares the hell out of me. But it's something that's going to happen in the future. But from the talent side, even though we produce the talent that's required tomorrow, it's going to be obsolete in 3 to 5 years. So it's very critical for companies to provide that training that gives them the ability to move up the ladder. Because people are going to move from company to company, from industry to industry, if they don't feel their company is investing in them. And so that's very important. Just a couple of comments. When we talk about supply chain talent and we ask industry the important attributes, first of all is they have to understand end-to-end supply chain. if I asked everybody in this room what a supply chain was, I'd get different answers from everybody. I know that from a fact. But it's important that the talent that we produce understands the impact of upstream supply chain, the sourcing and procurement, on downstream all the way to delivery to the customer, and the returns management and sustainability. The other thing that's important that's, I think, changing dramatically is industry wants supply chain talent that knows how a company makes a profit. Not just reducing cost, not just how improving revenue, which is kind of ignored in supply chain talent, but how they do both to increase that margin. And that's, we have to listen to industry and then adjust our curriculum to meet that demand. And that's an ongoing process. You know, universities, they don't change fast. Okay, so we're taking a look at how can we change faster to meet these changing demands in supply chain.
As you're both in academia, if I can just ask, do you see a future of colleges in 20 years? Do you think colleges will exist as they do today and universities will exist as they do today into the future?
No.
That's our next panel, Bob.
Sorry.
Whatever that window
I'm
is,
just super
things
curious.
are changing rapidly.
Right.
And students want it easier, they want it, and we need to provide it cheaper, and they want to do it more online. Universities are struggling to make their costs. I mean, we're a private university. We started, you are, as well. We start at $53,000 for our tuition. To live on campus, to live away from home is $75,000, $80,000 a year. For an undergraduate, 18-year-old student. It's tough, it's gotta change.
But from a student's perspective, I think the important thing is to learn how to think, how to problem solve, how to adapt to new situations. So it's independent if you are sitting at university or taking an online course. The skill that you want to acquire is how can I think for myself? How can I problem solve? How can I adapt? And then have like an online course or whatever to give you the basics. Let's say in the tech world, the basics is statistics, computer programming, and also how to talk with people, how to deal with people. This is very important.
We have time for one more question. Sorry if I missed you before.
Thank you. So I've seen a lot of recent developments at the Port of LA, Long Beach, and in the trucking industry. And you guys were mentioning how the trucking companies sort of get squeezed out when the margins get tight. And I feel like with technology, as related to this session, do you feel like the trucking industry as a whole and their kind of trade organizations, do you think they're growing in power and clout right now? Because it feels like to me they've been making some advancements and striving a little harder to ask and to be a little bit more hardly or persuasive in some of their arguments for what they're demanding. So I'm just thinking, do you think technology is kind of enabling them to ask for more, or is it the opposite?
And you're talking about like large trucking, small trucking, all trucking?
All trucking. So for example, like the HTA, the Harbor Trucking Association, do you feel like they're getting more
from
power?
shippers? I don't. Not from my lens. Just over the past few months, and as I've gone and talked to tens of shippers, right? I think when the market flips, and we are in a very soft market right now, it's about to turn, because just that's what happens with this market. Shippers they've been doing this for a long time, so they're taking advantage of that. And I don't think trucking, and I'll give you one specific example, which is when shippers have bottlenecks and they have the facilities to deal with it, they actually turn and convert more or most of their shipments into drop. I don't know if you know what that is, right? So you drop a trailer, and then it gives them a flex capacity, and it gives them, and I kind of politely say, hey, is this masking another problem? And it is. It's masking an inefficiency in the distribution center, or the way they plan their labor and planning. But in a soft market, we see some of our shippers going up to 75, 80% in drop, especially in the retail space or the home goods space. And then when the market tightens, guess what? Truckers have the upper hand. It's spot is king. People are not accepting their loads, and now it's a lot of live. And that phenomena of just a small mechanic and a differentiation, the mix of that by shipper swings widely. So to answer your question, I don't think so. I don't think unless you're a very large carrier and now you're negotiating a dedicated fleet in this mixed model. I don't really see truckers in a soft market have the upper hand. And it's a very tactical and a transactional, and it's actually what exasperates this problem on both ends of the spectrum. There's no trust, there's no long-term view, there's no accountability, there's no teeth, right? So yeah, I don't know if you have
Well,
anything.
the only thing I was going to mention, because you brought up LA Long Beach, most of those trucking companies that are operating out of there are drayage companies.
Drayage, yeah.
Right? So they're not the long haul truckers, they're not the LTL, they're not the parcel carriers. And they have specific challenges because of the congestion. If you've ever been on
Check in, check out.
on that freeway that goes from the port inland, it's horrible. And so there's I don't know if it's a law, it's a mandate, it's a goal, but it's for all those drayage carriers to be green, to move their fuel to propane or liquid, whatever that is.
LNG, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that stuff. But to be green or electric, and that's a major cost. So who's going to incur that cost? Ultimately, if it's going to be mandated by government, then it's going to be the consumer that has to pay for it. Because I think the drayage companies are willing to do it if it's required. Everybody has to share in the cost. But I think long haul carriers still have a great opportunity, even with. You can take a look at the stock market and see how a lot of the carriers, the large carriers, are doing. They're having very, very profitable periods. So that's really.
Well, and I know we need to wrap up, Brian, but I think your question was, is tech going to change the leverage situation for these carriers? And so maybe you can say, drayage carriers in the harbor have been like the bottom of the totem pole in the supply chain for a long time. So could tech help galvanize them in a way to give them a little bit more leverage to minimize the delta between the peak and the trough? Absolutely. I think that's the whole goal of all of this, is to make everybody's life less volatile. And so, yes, parties are going to sacrifice leverage and others are going to gain leverage in that situation, but the volatility will be lower across the board. So I think that's maybe a way to think about it, right? So thank you so much. I could go on for another hour here, but thank you, Brian. Thank you to our panel, too.